Sold your car for $900. I need the money, my wife texted. I replied, I understand. She wrote back, finally being reasonable. I didn't tell her it was a 1985 gold-plated Cadillac worth $2.80 million. The buyer called mu epsilon 30 minutes later. You know how some days start normal and then take a hard left turn straight into crazy down? Yeah, Tuesday was one of those days. I was elbow deep under the kitchen sink in my garage apartment, wrestling with a pipe that had apparently decided to cosplay as a stubborn toddler, when my phone decided to ruin my life with a single buzz. Not a ring, not a call, just one innocent little buzz that would make me question every life choice I'd made since deciding to marry into the underestimation Olympics family. The message was from my beloved wife, delivered with all the warmth and consideration of a tax audit notice. Sold your car for $900. I need the money. That's it. No. Hey honey, hope your day's going well. No, sorry to bother you while you're fixing our perpetually broken plumbing. Hell, she didn't even throw in one of those passive-aggressive smiley faces that wives use when they're about to drop a nuclear bomb on your Tuesday afternoon. Just straight facts, delivered like she was announcing the weather or telling me we were out of milk. I stared at that text message for what felt like 17 years, but was probably closer to 30 seconds, my wrench still dripping with whatever mysterious gunk had been clogging our pipes. A car? Not just any car, mind you, my 1985 gold-plated Cadillac DeVille. This wasn't some beat-up Honda with questionable air conditioning and a prayer holding the bumper on. This was a legitimate piece of automotive history that gleamed like a disco ball having an identity crisis in the afternoon sun. When I drove that beauty down Main Street, people didn't just look. They stared, they pointed, they probably questioned their life choices and wondered what kind of magic I'd worked to afford such magnificence. But apparently, to my wife, it was just the car taking up space in the driveway. I found myself chewing the inside of my cheek, a delightful nervous habit I'd picked up somewhere between puberty and my first marriage counseling session. The metallic taste of my own anxiety mixed beautifully with the lingering flavor of the gas station coffee I'd been nursing since 6 in the morning. After what felt like an eternity of internal screaming, I managed to type back a response that would have made Gandhi proud of my restraint. I understand. 2 words. Simple, dignified, completely devoid of the 17 different ways I wanted to express my feelings about this situation, most of which would have required censorship and possibly a lawyer. Her reply came faster than a NASCAR pit stop, finally being reasonable. Finally being reasonable. Finally being reasonable. Lady, I once ate a gas station burrito that had been sitting under those heat lamps since the Clinton administration and lived to tell the tale. That's reasonable. I once agreed to let her mother move in with us for just a few weeks. That turned into 8 months of passive-aggressive comments about my housekeeping skills. That was reasonable. I even nodded politely when her brother explained his brilliant plan to get rich flipping NFTs of his pet hamster. Reasonable doesn't even begin to cover that level of patience. But selling a car worth more money than most people see in their entire lifetimes for the price of a decent laptop? That wasn't reasonable. That was felony-level stupid with a side of, how did you even manage to function as an adult long enough to find someone willing to buy it? See, here's the thing about my 1985 Cadillac DeVille that my dear wife seemed to have missed during our 5 years of marriage. It wasn't just gold-colored. It was gold-plated. As in, actual gold had been applied to this vehicle by people who knew what they were doing, back when Elvis Presley was still making grown women faint just by moving his hips. This car had more history in its trunk than most museums had in their entire collection, and she'd just sold it for less money than we spent on groceries last month. I sat there on my garage floor, surrounded by the tools of my trade and the remnants of my dignity, wondering how exactly I was supposed to explain to people that my wife had just committed what amounted to automotive murder. How do you tell your buddies at the local car show that your pride and joy, the vehicle they'd all admired, photographed, and probably dreamed about owning, was now driving off into the sunset with some stranger who'd probably recognized a deal that was too good to be legal? The worst part? She actually thought she was helping our financial situation. Like we were some struggling couple living paycheck to paycheck, counting pennies to make rent, surviving on ramen noodles and hope. If only she knew the truth about exactly how broke her husband really was. If only she'd bothered to ask a single question about the car she'd just sold. Or maybe taken 2 seconds to wonder why a supposedly poor mechanic was driving around in what looked like a mobile gold mine. But no, in her mind, I was just her underachieving husband with expensive hobbies and questionable taste in vehicles. The guy who spent too much time in the garage, wore the same jeans 3 days in a row, and apparently couldn't be trusted to contribute meaningfully to the household finances. She'd been treating me like her financially challenged project for years, and this was just the latest attempt to fix our money problems. Little did she know that our money problems were about as real as her brother's NFT empire, and this solution she'd just implemented was going to cost us more money than she'd probably ever seen in her entire life. But hey, at least she was finally being reasonable, right? 30 minutes later, just as I was beginning to convince myself that maybe this was all some elaborate prank orchestrated by the universe to test my blood pressure medication, my phone decided to ring. Not buzz this time. Actually ring, like it had something important to say. The caller ID showed one of those numbers that screams, professional business person who probably wears suits that cost more than most people's cars. And for a split second, I wondered if this was some telemarketer with incredibly bad timing trying to sell me extended warranty coverage for the vehicle my wife had just sold out from under me. I almost let it go to voicemail, because honestly, what were the odds that this call had anything to do with my current automotive crisis? But something, maybe curiosity, maybe masochism, maybe just the desperate hope that someone was calling to tell me this whole thing had been a mistake, made me swipe to answer. Mr. Bennett? The voice on the other end was so polished and refined that I immediately felt underdressed, despite the fact that we were talking on the phone and he couldn't see my grease-stained work shirt and the questionable stains on my jeans that could have been motor oil or yesterday's lunch. This guy sounded like the type of person who wore cufflinks just to pump gas, who probably had his shoes professionally shined every morning, and who used words like indeed and quite so in casual conversation. Yeah, that's me. I managed to croak out, suddenly aware that I sounded like I'd been gargling with gravel and regret. Wonderful. This is Charles Morrison, from Morrison & Associates Classic Cars. He said it like he was announcing his entrance at a debutante ball, all smooth confidence and barely contained excitement. Morrison & Associates. Even the name sounded expensive, like the kind of place where they served champagne while you browsed their inventory and probably required a credit check just to look at their business cards. My heart did something that could generously be called a somersault, but more accurately resembled a seizure. Morrison & Associates wasn't just any classic car dealership. These were the big leagues, the kind of people who dealt with vehicles that belonged in museums, not driveways. The kind of establishment where affordable started at 6 figures and went up from there like a rocket ship aimed at bankruptcy. I believe I just purchased your Cadillac, he continued, and I swear I could hear the smile in his voice, like he'd just won the lottery and was calling to share the good news with his accountant. My coffee mug, which I'd been clutching like a lifeline, suddenly felt very heavy in my hands. You what now? Your 1985 Cadillac DeVille, gold-plated exterior, original leather interior, in remarkable condition. He was reciting details like he was reading from a spec sheet, each word delivered with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker. Serial number ending in 7749, if I'm not mistaken. The coffee mug slipped from my fingers and crashed to the floor, sending lukewarm caffeine splashing across my work boots and the concrete floor of my garage. I didn't even notice. My brain was too busy trying to process what this meant. Why Charles Morrison from the fancy classic car dealership was calling me about my Cadillac, and how exactly he'd managed to buy it from my wife when I'd never even heard his name before this conversation. That's the one. I stammered, stepping over the spreading puddle of coffee and broken ceramic like it was just another Tuesday casualty. Excellent. Morrison practically purred with satisfaction. I must say, your wife drove quite the bargain. $900 for such a pristine example of American automotive craftsmanship. Well, it's simply unheard of in today's market. $900. There it was, confirmed by the man who'd actually handed over the cash. My wife had really, truly, actually sold my Cadillac for less money than most people spend on their monthly car payment. I felt something that might have been my soul leaving my body, or possibly just my lunch threatening to make a reappearance. But here's where things get truly fascinating. Morrison continued, completely oblivious to my internal breakdown. While examining the vehicle, standard procedure for any acquisition, you understand, I discovered some rather interesting documentation in the glove compartment. Documentation. Why did that word suddenly sound ominous? Like the automotive equivalent of finding a ticking bomb in your basement. Authentication papers, he said, and I swear the temperature in my garage dropped about 10 degrees. Original registration documents, maintenance records dating back to 1985, and most remarkably, a certificate of ownership transfer from Graceland Enterprises. Graceland Enterprises, as in Elvis Presley's Graceland. As in, the king of rock and roll himself had once sat his legendary hips in the driver's seat of my Cadillac, had probably sung along to the radio while cruising down some Memphis highway, had maybe even used the cup holders for his famous peanut butter and banana smoothies. I'm sorry, I said, because my brain had apparently decided to take a vacation right when I needed it most. Did you just say Elvis? Indeed I did. Morrison's excitement was so palpable I could practically feel it through the phone. This particular vehicle was purchased directly from Elvis Presley's estate in 1978, 3 years before you acquired it. The authentication is ironclad, original purchase receipts, signed documentation, even photographs of Mr. Presley with the vehicle at various Graceland events. My legs decided they weren't interested in supporting my body weight anymore, so I found myself sitting heavily on my workbench, staring at the oil stain on the floor where my Cadillac used to park. Elvis Presley. The Elvis Presley had owned my car, had driven my car, had probably sung Hound Dog while adjusting my rearview mirror. Current auction estimates. Morrison continued, apparently unaware that he was systematically destroying my will to live, placed the value at approximately $2.8 million. Minimum, $2.8 million. With an M, as in, more money than I'd ever seen in one place. More money than most people would earn in their entire working lives. More money than my wife's entire family had probably accumulated across 3 generations of questionable financial decisions. My wife had sold Elvis Presley's personal Cadillac, a piece of rock and roll history, a genuine artifact from the King's own collection, for $900. $900. Less than the price of a decent laptop, less than what most people spend on their monthly streaming subscriptions, less than I'd paid for the new alternator I'd installed just last month. I made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite a sob, something that perfectly captured the absolute absurdity of my current situation. Morrison, bless his professionally polished heart, interpreted this as enthusiasm. I wanted to call personally to discuss the transaction, he said. This is, without question, one of the most significant automotive finds of my career. As Morrison continued explaining the fascinating history of what used to be my car, complete with detailed descriptions of Elvis's personal modifications, the custom sound system he'd installed, and the apparently legendary status this particular vehicle held among serious collectors, I found myself leaning back in my garage chair, staring at the empty space where my Cadillac used to sit, and having what could only be described as an out-of-body experience mixed with a hefty dose of cosmic irony. See, the thing that made this whole situation absolutely hilarious in the most twisted way possible was that my wife had always rolled her eyes whenever she caught me washing and waxing that Cadillac. Every weekend, without fail, I'd be out there in the driveway with my microfiber cloths and my premium car wax, treating that golden beauty like it was the Hope Diamond on wheels. And every weekend, without fail, my dear wife would walk by, shake her head, and mutter something about tacky bling or gaudy show-off nonsense, or my personal favorite, that ridiculous golden eyesore that screams midlife crisis from 3 blocks away. Tacky. This woman had just called Elvis Presley's personal Sunday driving car tacky. The king of rock and roll, the man who revolutionized American music, the cultural icon whose hip movements once scandalized an entire generation. His taste in automobiles was apparently tacky according to my wife. I'm pretty sure that constituted some kind of cultural blasphemy, the automotive equivalent of calling the Mona Lisa that weird chick with the creepy smile. But it wasn't just my wife who'd never quite grasped the significance of my automotive pride and joy. Oh no, her entire family had been in on this massive underestimation project for years. Her parents, her siblings, probably even the family dog had been trained to look at me like I was some kind of barely functioning adult who'd somehow stumbled through life without developing any real understanding of financial responsibility or practical decision-making. To them, I was just the broke mechanic who'd somehow convinced their precious daughter to marry down. The guy who worked with his hands, got grease under his fingernails, and apparently had such poor judgment that he'd spent whatever meager savings he'd managed to scrape together on some flashy car that served no practical purpose other than attracting unwanted attention and draining his bank account with maintenance costs. They thought my garage was a hobby. A hobby. Like I was some middle-aged man playing with toy trains in his basement, except my toys happened to be full-sized vehicles, and my basement happened to be a fully equipped automotive workshop. Every time I mentioned working late in the garage, I could see it in their eyes, that mixture of pity and barely concealed condescension that said, "Oh, there goes poor old Dave again, tinkering away with his little hobby while the grown-ups handle the real business of making money and contributing to society." What they didn't know, what they'd never bothered to ask about, never showed the slightest curiosity regarding, was that their supposedly broke son-in-law was actually a silent partner in 3 different auto restoration shops scattered across the tri-state area. 3 highly successful, extremely profitable businesses that specialized in bringing classic American muscle cars back to their former glory. We're talking about the kind of operation where people shipped us vehicles from across the country, where our waiting list stretched out for months, where a single restoration project could bring in more money than most people saw in a year. The joke was on them, and it had been for years. While my brother-in-law Chad, yes, of course his name was Chad, sat around flipping NFTs and explaining to anyone who'd listen how he was going to revolutionize the digital art world with pictures of cartoon monkeys wearing different hats, I was quietly making more money in a single month than he'd probably earned in his entire cryptocurrency career. While my father-in-law complained about his 401k performance and lectured me about the importance of building wealth for the future, I was already building it, one restored Mustang and Camaro at a time. But I'd let them think whatever they wanted to think. It was easier that way, honestly. Less complicated. No awkward family dinners where I had to explain my business model or justify my success. No uncomfortable questions about why I chose to live in a modest apartment above my garage when I could clearly afford something more impressive. No expectations, no pressure, no requests for loans or investment advice, or any of the other delightful complications that came with people knowing you had money. I'd cultivated this image of the struggling mechanic so thoroughly that even I sometimes forgot it wasn't real. The beat-up pickup truck I drove to family gatherings, that was a choice, not a necessity. The simple clothes, the modest lifestyle, the occasional comment about watching the budget, all of it was carefully constructed theater designed to keep my actual financial situation as far under the radar as humanly possible. And it had worked beautifully, right up until the moment my wife decided to helpfully solve our non-existent financial crisis by selling the most valuable thing she thought we owned. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a butter knife and serve it at a comedy club. Here she was, trying to be the responsible adult in the relationship, trying to make the tough decisions and sacrifice our luxury items for the greater good of our household budget. She probably felt like such a hero, such a practical, clear-thinking partner who was willing to do what needed to be done while her impractical husband was off playing with his toys in the garage. If only she knew that those toys in the garage represented a business empire that generated more passive income in a month than her part-time job at the dental office brought in during an entire year. If only she'd bothered to ask why a supposedly cash-strapped mechanic had access to professional-grade restoration equipment worth more than most people's houses. If only she'd wondered how I managed to afford the premium tools, the specialized parts, the custom modifications I was constantly making to various vehicles. But she hadn't asked, and neither had the rest of her family. They'd been perfectly content to pat me on the head like a well-meaning but financially incompetent golden retriever, secure in their assumption that they understood exactly who I was and what I was capable of. And I'd been perfectly content to let them, because it meant I could go about my business without interference, without advice, without the endless complications that came with people knowing your real story. Until today. Until my wife's helpful gesture had just cost us $2.8 million and exposed the ridiculous gap between perception and reality that had been the foundation of our entire relationship. After Morrison finally finished explaining every single detail about Elvis's automotive preferences, apparently the king had a thing for custom cup holders and preferred his radio tuned to specific stations even when the car was parked. I found myself staring at my phone like it had just delivered news that aliens had landed and they were really into classic cars. I needed backup. I needed documentation. I needed someone who could help me prove to my wife's family that they'd just witnessed the automotive equivalent of using a Picasso painting as a napkin. So I did what any rational person would do in my situation. I called Marcus. Marcus was my assistant, though calling him an assistant made it sound way more professional than it actually was. The kid was 22 years old, survived entirely on energy drinks and whatever caffeine-based substances could be legally purchased at convenience stores, and had somehow managed to keep my business paperwork organized despite what appeared to be a terminal case of ADHD and an unhealthy obsession with true crime podcasts. I'd hired him fresh out of community college when he'd answered my Craigslist ad with a resume that included proficient in Microsoft Excel and can identify most serial killers by their childhood photos. He answered on the second ring, which meant he was either already at his desk or had fallen asleep there again. With Marcus, both scenarios were equally likely. Bennett Restoration, this is Marcus, and before you ask, no, I haven't finished organizing last month's receipts because I got distracted by this documentary about people who collect vintage lunchboxes, and honestly, some of these lunchboxes are worth more than my car, which isn't saying much because my car is basically a mobile prayer, but still. Marcus, I interrupted, because letting him finish that sentence would have taken approximately 17 minutes and covered topics ranging from lunchbox collecting to his grandmother's recipe for anxiety cookies. I need you to prepare some files. Emergency status. There was a pause, followed by what sounded like an entire energy drink being consumed in one gulp. Emergency status? Are we talking like IRS audit emergency, or more like that time you accidentally ordered chrome bumpers for a Pinto? Worse. Much worse. I need you to pull the complete Cadillac file. Another pause. I could practically hear his caffeine-addled brain trying to process this request. The Cadillac file? You mean the sacred binder? The 100-page monument to automotive obsession that you made me organize with color-coded tabs and laminated photographs. Yes, exactly that one. The binder that includes 17 different angles of you polishing the rims. That's the one. The binder with the maintenance receipts going back to when dinosaurs roamed the earth. Marcus, I swear to God, if you don't stop asking questions and start pulling files. Okay. Geez, you're scarier than my economics professor, and that guy once made a student cry by explaining compound interest. I heard the unmistakable sound of filing cabinets being yanked open with more force than was strictly necessary. But seriously, boss, why do we need the Cadillac files? Did someone finally make you an offer you couldn't refuse? Please tell me you didn't sell it to that weird guy who collects cars shaped like animals. And that's when I had to explain to my caffeinated assistant that my wife had sold Elvis Presley's personal Cadillac for $900 while I was fixing a sink, and that I was about to blow the minds of every single person who'd ever assumed I was too broke to afford decent takeout, let alone own a piece of rock and roll history worth more than a small house. The silence that followed was so complete, I thought Marcus might have actually died from caffeine withdrawal or shock. Then, slowly, I heard him say, "Boss, please tell me you're joking. Please tell me this is some kind of elaborate prank you're pulling because you're bored and want to see if you can make me spill energy drink all over your precious paperwork." Not joking, Marcus. Dead serious. My wife sold the king's car for less than most people spend on groceries. Holy, there was a crash, followed by some creative language that would have made a sailor blush, followed by what sounded like Marcus scrambling around his office picking up whatever had just hit the floor. Okay, I'm pulling everything. Insurance papers, authentication documents, purchase records, maintenance logs, that weird photo album you made of the car in different lighting conditions. It's not weird, it's thorough documentation. Boss, you have a picture of the Cadillac at sunrise labeled Morning Glory Shot Number 4, the Golden Hour Chronicles. That's not documentation, that's automotive poetry. The kid had a point, but this wasn't the time for artistic criticism. Just get me everything, Marcus. Every single piece of paper that proves what that car was worth and what it meant. I'm about to have the most expensive conversation of my marriage, and I need ammunition. You got it, boss. But can I just say, this is like the most insane thing that's ever happened since I started working for you. And that includes the time you bought that Mustang that turned out to be 3 different Mustangs welded together by someone who'd apparently never seen a Mustang before. While Marcus rummaged through files and muttered to himself about the cruel ironies of life, I found myself thinking about how my so-called broke existence had been the performance of a lifetime. The beat-up house I lived in, bought in cash specifically because it had a perfect garage setup and nobody would look twice at a guy in a modest neighborhood. The old pickup truck I drove to family gatherings, a deliberate choice to maintain my cover as the financially struggling relative who probably needed help making his car payments. People looked at me and saw exactly what I wanted them to see. A guy barely scraping by, someone who worked with his hands and probably watched his bank account balance more carefully than a hawk watching a field mouse. They never saw the man who owned multiple businesses, who had investment portfolios that would make their financial advisors weep with envy, who could afford to buy and sell vehicles worth more than their annual salaries without even checking his account balance. Boss, Marcus's voice interrupted my internal monologue. I've got everything pulled, and I'm scanning it all into digital format, because honestly, this feels like the kind of situation where you're going to need backup copies of the backup copies. But I gotta ask, what's the plan here? Are you finally going to tell people the truth about your secret empire of automotive restoration excellence? Secret empire. I kind of like that description. It made me sound like a superhero whose power was turning rusted hunks of metal into gleaming masterpieces worth more than most people's retirement funds. That evening, I walked into my in-laws' house carrying a leather folder that looked like it belonged in the briefcase of someone who charged $500 an hour just to answer their phone. The folder was thick, professional, and practically screamed, important documents that will ruin your entire worldview. But of course, nobody in this house was going to notice that detail. They were too busy celebrating what they believed was my wife's brilliant financial masterstroke. The scene that greeted me was like something out of a sitcom, except the laugh track was playing inside my head, and it was tinged with the kind of bitter irony that made you question whether the universe had a sense of humor or just really enjoyed watching people step on metaphorical rakes. My wife was sprawled across their overstuffed couch like she'd just solved world hunger, climate change, and the national debt all in one afternoon. She had that satisfied smirk that wives get when they think they've successfully managed their husband's life without his input. You know, the same expression she wore when she reorganized my tool shed for efficiency, and I spent 3 weeks looking for my socket wrenches. Her mother was in the kitchen, baking cookies and humming some tune that probably dated back to when people thought the earth was flat and car phones were the height of technology. She had flour in her hair and that blissful expression that mothers get when they think their daughter has finally married someone with a functioning brain cell. Every few minutes, she'd peek around the corner and beam at my wife like she'd just watched her cure cancer. Her father was buried in his crossword puzzle, looking like the human version of meh made flesh. This was his default state, somewhere between mildly interested and completely unconscious, with just enough awareness to grunt occasionally when someone asked him a direct question. He was the kind of guy who could sleep through a nuclear war but would wake up immediately if someone changed the channel during his favorite fishing show. "Good news, honey," my wife chirped the moment I walked through the door, her voice dripping with the kind of artificial sweetness that usually preceded very bad news. "I solved our financial problem." I set the leather folder down on their coffee table with just enough force to make a satisfying thunk, like a judge's gavel announcing the beginning of proceedings in the case of delusion versus reality. "Oh, really?" I asked, settling into their recliner with all the casual confidence of someone who was about to drop a nuclear bomb on their evening. "Did Jeff Bezos adopt us? Did we win the lottery and forget to check the numbers? Did someone discover oil in our backyard?" She rolled her eyes in that special way that wives have perfected, the eye roll that somehow manages to convey disappointment, superiority, and barely contained frustration all in one fluid motion. "Don't be dramatic, Dave. I sold your Cadillac. You know, that ridiculously flashy thing that was just sitting there in our driveway, taking up space and probably dropping our property values. Just sitting there, taking up space. Like Elvis Presley's personal automobile was some kind of automotive lawn ornament. a golden paperweight that served no purpose other than making the neighbors wonder why we had something so nice when we were supposedly living paycheck to paycheck. I opened the folder slowly, deliberately, like a magician about to reveal the trick that would make everyone question everything they thought they knew about reality. The papers inside were arranged in perfect order. Marcus had done his usual obsessive-compulsive filing job, complete with color-coded tabs and protective plastic sleeves that made everything look official and expensive and very, very serious. Sitting there, yes, I said, pulling out the first document with theatrical precision. Just collecting dust and, oh, this is interesting, only about $2.8 million in value. But hey, no biggie, right? I mean, what's a few million between family members? The change in atmosphere was immediate and spectacular. My wife's smirk died on her face like someone had just told her that her favorite reality show had been canceled. Her jaw went slack, then tightened, then went through a series of expressions that looked like she was trying to solve advanced calculus in her head while simultaneously having an allergic reaction to the concept of large numbers. Her father's crossword puzzle fluttered to the floor as he looked up for the first time since I'd arrived, his eyes wide behind his reading glasses. "Wait a minute there, Dave," he said slowly, like he was testing each word to make sure it wouldn't explode in his mouth. "Did you just say million? With an M?" "Yep," I confirmed, enjoying this moment more than I probably should have. 2.8 million. With an M. As in, more money than this entire family's net worth combined. And that's including Uncle Jerry's collection of lottery tickets and your coin jar full of quarters. Her mother appeared in the doorway, still wearing her apron but no longer humming. She was holding a mixing bowl in one hand and a wooden spoon in the other, frozen like someone had hit the pause button on her entire existence. Cookie batter was slowly dripping from the spoon onto their hardwood floor, but she didn't seem to notice. She was too busy staring at me like I'd just announced that I was actually an alien from Mars and had been studying their family for scientific purposes. 2.8 million, she whispered, and I swear the mixing bowl trembled in her hands. "Dave, please tell me you're exaggerating. Please tell me this is one of your jokes." But it wasn't a joke, and the look on my face must have conveyed that pretty clearly, because the mixing bowl slipped from her fingers and crashed to the floor, sending cookie batter splattering across their kitchen tiles like some kind of domestic crime scene. The sound of ceramic breaking seemed to echo through the house, punctuating the moment when their entire understanding of their son-in-law shifted from harmless financial burden to guy who apparently owned automotive treasure and didn't mention it for 5 years. My wife was still staring at me, her mouth opening and closing like a fish that had suddenly found itself on dry land. But Dave," she stammered, "I didn't know. How was I supposed to know? It's just a car. Just a car." The phrase hung in the air like a bad smell that everyone was trying to ignore but couldn't quite escape. I reached into my leather folder with all the ceremony of a prosecutor presenting the smoking gun in a murder trial. Except instead of evidence of criminal activity, I was about to present evidence of the most expensive case of marital miscommunication in recent history. The business card came out first. Charles Morrison's elegant calling card with its embossed lettering and paper so thick you could probably build a small house out of it. I placed it on their coffee table like I was laying down a royal flush in the world's most expensive poker game. "Charles Morrison, Morrison and Associates Classic Cars," I announced, sliding the card across the table toward my wife with the dramatic flair of someone who'd been practicing this moment in his head for the past 4 hours. "Ring any bells? Maybe sounds familiar from, oh, I don't know, the phone call you had with him this morning when you handed over Elvis Presley's personal automobile for less money than most people spend on a vacation to Disney World." My wife picked up the business card like it might bite her, turning it over in her hands as if the other side might contain some kind of explanation that would make this whole situation less catastrophic. The card was beautiful, professional, and probably cost more to print than most people's weekly grocery budget. The kind of business card that screamed, "I deal with items so expensive that I don't even put prices on my website, because if you have to ask, you can't afford it." Next came the authentication papers, and let me tell you, these weren't your typical DMV documents. These were the automotive equivalent of a royal genealogy, complete with official seals, notarized signatures, and enough legal terminology to make a Supreme Court justice weep with joy. I spread them across the coffee table like a dealer laying out cards, each document more damning than the last. Authentication papers, I explained, channeling my inner David Attenborough as if I were narrating a nature documentary about the mating habits of extremely expensive automobiles. Original registration documents dating back to 1977. Purchase receipts from Graceland Enterprises. Maintenance records signed by Elvis's personal mechanic. And here's my personal favorite. I pulled out a photograph that Marcus had somehow managed to locate in the depths of our files. A black and white picture that looked like it belonged in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. It showed Elvis himself, in all his rhinestone jumpsuit glory, leaning casually against the hood of my Cadillac like he was posing for the cover of an album that would eventually sell millions of copies. A photograph of the king himself with his golden chariot, I said, placing it in the center of the table where everyone could see it clearly. Taken at Graceland in 1976, just about a year before he decided that maybe gold-plated Cadillacs were more trouble than they were worth and sold it to a private collector who eventually sold it to me. The silence that followed was so profound I could hear the cookies burning in the oven, but nobody seemed to care about potential kitchen disasters when they were staring at photographic evidence that their supposedly broke relative had been driving around in a piece of American cultural history. Her father's crossword puzzle had been completely abandoned, lying on the floor like a casualty of war. He was leaning forward in his chair, squinting at the photograph like he was trying to determine whether it was real or some elaborate hoax I'd cooked up in my spare time. That's really Elvis?" he asked, his voice carrying the kind of awe usually reserved for religious experiences or winning lottery tickets. "That's really Elvis," I confirmed. "The king of rock and roll, in the flesh, posing with what used to be my car, but is now Charles Morrison's newest acquisition, thanks to my wife's impressive negotiating skills." Her mother had given up all pretense of kitchen activities and was now standing behind the couch, still wearing her flour-dusted apron, staring at the documents like they contained the secrets of the universe. "But Dave," she said slowly, her voice trembling with the kind of disbelief that accompanies major paradigm shifts. This says Elvis owned the car?" "That's correct," I replied, sipping my water with all the casual confidence of James Bond ordering a martini in the middle of a high-stakes casino heist. Elvis Aaron Presley, born January 8, 1935, died August 16, 1977, king of rock and roll, owner of Graceland, revolutionary hip mover, and former proprietor of the Cadillac that my beloved wife just sold for $900. The number hung in the air like a physical presence, growing more ridiculous with each passing second. $900. For Elvis's car. It was like selling the Declaration of Independence at a garage sale or using the Mona Lisa as a placemat during Thanksgiving dinner. My wife was blinking rapidly, the way people do when they're trying to process information that doesn't fit with their understanding of reality. But I didn't know," she repeated, like saying it enough times would somehow make the situation less catastrophic. "How was I supposed to know it was Elvis's car? It's not like it had a sign on it." "Actually," I said, reaching back into my folder and pulling out yet another document, "it kind of did. Remember that little plaque mounted on the dashboard? The one you always said was tacky gold decoration. Turns out that was a commemorative plaque from Graceland, complete with Elvis's signature and the date of purchase. But I guess when you're in a hurry to solve our imaginary financial crisis, you don't have time to read the fine print." The plaque documentation was perhaps the most damning piece of evidence, because it proved that the car's significance hadn't exactly been hidden. It had been right there, mounted prominently on the dashboard, announcing to anyone who bothered to look that this wasn't just any gold-plated Cadillac. This was the gold-plated Cadillac, the one that had carried the king himself through the streets of Memphis back when gas was 30 cents a gallon and the biggest problem in America was figuring out what to do with all the prosperity. Her father was now holding his head in his hands, either from shock or from trying to calculate exactly how much money had just walked out of their family's life. "So when you said $900, he began. "I meant $900, my wife confirmed miserably. "Cash." He seemed really excited about it. Said it was exactly what he'd been looking for. I bet he was excited. Charles Morrison had just acquired a $2.8 million piece of rock and roll history for less money than most people spent on their monthly car insurance. If I were him, I'd probably be doing backflips in my professionally decorated office while calling all my collector friends to brag about the deal of the century. Just when I thought the evening couldn't get any more surreal, when I was pretty sure I'd reached the absolute peak of holy crap moments that one family gathering could contain, I decided to pull out the piece de resistance, the document that would transform this situation from expensive mistake to completely reality-altering catastrophe. I reached into my leather folder one more time, moving with the deliberate precision of a surgeon about to perform the world's most expensive operation, and withdrew what looked like an ordinary piece of paper but was actually a certified cashier's check that represented more money than this entire family had probably ever seen in one place. The check was beautiful in its simplicity, just numbers and letters arranged in a way that could fund a small country space program or buy a decent-sized mansion in Beverly Hills. Now here's where things get really interesting, I said, holding the check like it was the holy grail of automotive transactions. This is a cashier's check from Morrison & Associates, made out to yours truly, for the full, authenticated value of Elvis Presley's personal Cadillac DeVille. I placed it on the coffee table with the kind of ceremonial gravity usually reserved for signing peace treaties or presenting Nobel Prizes. The check landed with a soft whisper that somehow managed to sound louder than thunder in the absolute silence that had settled over their living room like fog rolling in from the ocean. My wife stared at the check like it was a mythical creature that had just materialized in her living room. Something between a unicorn and a winning lottery ticket, beautiful and impossible and definitely not supposed to exist in her everyday reality. She leaned forward, squinting at the numbers as if looking at them from a different angle might change what they said. $2,800,000, she read aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. Each word seemed to cost her physical effort, like she was lifting weights with her vocal cords. But why would he pay that when he already bought it for $900? And there it was, the question that revealed just how little my dear wife understood about the difference between legally buying something and morally buying something. The difference between what you can get away with and what you should actually do when you're dealing with someone else's ignorance. Because, I explained, settling back in the recliner like a professor about to deliver the lecture that would change his students' entire understanding of the universe. Charles Morrison is what we in the business world call an honest human being. A rare specimen, I'll admit, but they do exist. When he realized he'd just purchased Elvis Presley's personal automobile from someone who clearly had no idea what they were selling, he did the right thing and paid the actual value instead of taking advantage of your impressive ignorance. The word ignorance hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was just getting started. My wife's face went through a series of color changes that would have been fascinating to a scientist studying the physiological effects of financial shock. Her father was now staring at me like I'd just announced that I was actually Superman and had been hiding my identity behind a pair of ordinary glasses. "So, you're not broke?" he asked, and I could practically hear the gears grinding in his head as he tried to process this fundamental shift in his understanding of his son-in-law's financial status. I pulled out my phone with all the casual confidence of someone about to demonstrate that water is wet and gravity makes things fall down. My banking app opened with a cheerful chime, displaying numbers that made my wife actually gasp out loud, a sound somewhere between surprise and the noise people make when they accidentally touch a hot stove. "This is just the checking account," I said, tilting the phone so they could all see the balance clearly. For $0.2 million, displayed in crisp digital numbers that seemed to glow against the screen like neon signs announcing, "Your assumptions were spectacularly wrong." My wife's gasp was louder this time, reaching decibel levels usually associated with fire alarms or emergency broadcasts. She was staring at my phone like it contained video evidence of Bigfoot riding the Loch Ness Monster while juggling flaming torches. $4.2 million, her mother whispered from behind the couch, her voice carrying the kind of awe usually reserved for religious revelations or discovering that your scratch-off lottery ticket was actually worth more than your mortgage. That's just in checking. Just the checking account," I confirmed, enjoying this moment more than a reasonable person probably should. "My investment portfolio is significantly larger. Would you like me to show you the account labeled Vacation Home Fund? Or maybe the one I call Retirement Before 50? Oh, and there's my personal favorite, Money I Made While You Thought I Was Poor Fund. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the neighbor's dog barking 3 houses away. Her father looked like someone had just explained quantum physics to him, using interpretive dance and balloon animals. Her mother was gripping the back of the couch like she needed physical support to process what she was seeing. "Dear Lord," her mother muttered, and I wasn't entirely sure if she was praying for forgiveness or just trying to invoke divine intervention to help her understand how her supposedly broke son-in-law had been hiding millions of dollars while eating their leftovers and graciously accepting their financial advice about budgeting and the importance of coupon clipping. "We've been calling you poor for years," she continued, her voice barely audible, like she was confessing to a crime that carried a significant prison sentence. I shrugged with all the nonchalance of someone who'd been playing the longest con in family history and had just revealed the punchline. "Well, I do wear the same jeans for a week straight," I admitted. "And I did eat gas station sushi that one time without checking the expiration date. So the poor judgment part was accurate, just not the poor money part." My wife was still staring at the phone screen, probably wondering if there was some kind of app that could reverse time and prevent her from making the most expensive mistake in the history of marital decision-making. The check from Morrison lay on the table between us like evidence in a trial where everyone was guilty of assumptions and the verdict was spectacularly wrong about everything. What happened next was like watching a comedy roast, except instead of professional comedians taking turns making fun of a celebrity, it was my in-laws slowly realizing that they'd been patronizing a millionaire for the better part of 5 years. The room had transformed into an impromptu therapy session where everyone was coming to terms with their spectacularly wrong assumptions about the guy who fixed their garbage disposal and drove a pickup truck that looked like it had survived several apocalypses. Her father was the first to break the shell-shocked silence, and when he spoke, his voice had that careful, measured tone that people use when they're trying not to sound like complete idiots, but are pretty sure they're about to anyway. "So Dave," he began, clearing his throat like he was about to deliver a eulogy for his own credibility, "when you said you couldn't afford that family trip to Yellowstone last summer, you were—" I leaned back in their recliner, which suddenly felt like a throne from which I could survey the wreckage of their misconceptions. "Oh, that weekend? I was busy buying a controlling interest in Tesla stock," I replied with the casual air of someone discussing the weather or their preference in breakfast cereals. "Made about $300,000 in profit the following week when Elon tweeted something about space cars. You know how it is." The look on his face was priceless, like someone had just explained that the moon was actually made of cheese and they'd been missing out on intergalactic dairy products their entire lives. His crossword puzzle lay forgotten on the floor, probably wondering why it had been abandoned in favor of this far more complex puzzle involving hidden millionaires and automotive treasure. Her mother emerged from behind the couch like a deer stepping into a clearing, still wearing her flour-dusted apron and carrying the psychological weight of years of offering me financial advice about the importance of generic brand groceries and store loyalty cards. "When you said you were budgeting," she said slowly, each word carefully measured like she was defusing a bomb made of embarrassment, "you meant—" "I was budgeting for a second house in Florida," I confirmed, enjoying the way her eyes widened to cartoon-like proportions. "Beachfront property, actually. Great investment potential. Plus, I figured it would be nice to have somewhere to escape when family gatherings got too intense. You know, like when people start giving me lectures about the importance of saving for retirement, while I'm already financially capable of retiring tomorrow and buying a yacht for entertainment. The Florida house wasn't even my biggest purchase that year, but I figured I'd ease them into the reality of my actual lifestyle rather than hitting them with the full scope of "your son-in-law owns more real estate than most small towns." My wife, meanwhile, had progressed from shocked silence to making small squeaking noises that sounded like a mouse being slowly compressed by the weight of her own poor decision-making. "So," she managed to croak out, her voice barely above a whisper, "all those late nights in the garage when you said you were working on projects." "Yeah, I wasn't fixing Mrs. Henderson's lawnmower for $20, I said, grinning at the memory of all those evenings she'd assumed I was tinkering with small engines while she watched reality TV shows about people who couldn't afford their mortgages. I was running 3 separate automotive restoration businesses with clients who shipped their classic cars from across the country for me to work on. Some of those projects bring in more money than your dental office makes in 6 months. The restoration businesses were my pride and joy, the kind of operation that people in the classic car world whispered about in hushed, reverent tones. We weren't talking about weekend warriors who restored cars as a hobby. We were talking about legitimate business enterprises that attracted collectors who thought nothing of spending more on a paint job than most people spend on their houses. Her father was now holding his head in his hands, either from the shock of discovering his son-in-law's secret financial empire or from the dawning realization of how many times he'd offered me unsolicited advice about money management while I was quietly building wealth at a rate that would make most financial advisors weep with envy. "The pickup truck," he said suddenly, looking up at me like he'd just solved the final clue in a particularly difficult crossword puzzle. "That beat-up old Ford you drive everywhere." "Strategic camouflage," I confirmed. "Amazing how people treat you differently when they think you're struggling to make ends meet. Plus, it's actually a classic 1967 F-100 with a completely rebuilt engine and custom interior that cost more than most people's new cars. But from the outside, it looks like something I probably bought from a guy named Cletus who operates out of a trailer park." The silence that followed was golden, the kind of perfect quiet that occurs when an entire family simultaneously realizes they've been spectacularly wrong about everything for years. I leaned back in the recliner, feeling like a magician who'd just pulled off the greatest trick of his career, making millions of dollars invisible for half a decade, while everyone around him assumed he was broke. "Guess who's actually broke in this relationship?" I said, letting the question hang in the air like smoke from a very expensive cigar. Spoiler alert, it's not me. My wife made another one of those squeaking noises, this one with a slightly different pitch that suggested she was beginning to grasp the full scope of what she'd done. Not just the car sale. Although selling Elvis Presley's Cadillac for $900 was certainly the headline act in this circus of financial disasters, but the years of treating her secretly wealthy husband like he needed guidance on basic money management. Her mother was now staring at me like I was a puzzle she'd been trying to solve for years and had just discovered that half the pieces were missing while the other half were from a completely different box. "You mean all those times I gave you coupons for the grocery store?" I appreciated the thought, I said diplomatically, because even in the middle of revealing my secret millionaire status, I wasn't about to tell my mother-in-law that her coupon collection had been about as useful to me as a submarine would be to a goldfish. Though I should probably mention that I own stock in most of the companies you were trying to help me save money on, including the grocery store chain. The revelation was complete. The rose session had reached its natural conclusion, and I was sitting in their living room like a financial superhero who'd just removed his mild-mannered disguise to reveal the cape underneath. The only question now was what happened next. 3 days later, my phone rang at 7 in the morning with the unmistakable sound of someone who'd been awake all night having what could charitably be called an existential crisis. My wife's voice came through the speaker with the kind of trembling uncertainty usually reserved for people calling to confess crimes or admit they'd accidentally adopted 17 cats. "Dave," she said, and I could practically hear her pacing around our apartment, probably wearing a groove in the hardwood floors we'd installed last year with money she'd assumed came from me taking on extra weekend jobs. "I Googled you." Now that was a sentence I'd been dreading for about 5 years. Not because I'd done anything illegal or embarrassing, unless you count the time I accidentally bid on a 1973 Mustang at an auction while drunk and ended up buying it for twice what it was worth, but because the internet had a way of making my carefully maintained cover story about being a struggling mechanic look like the elaborate fiction it actually was. "Oh really?" I said, because playing dumb had worked so well for me up until this point. "Find anything interesting? Please tell me it wasn't that article from 2019 where they photographed me next to that Lamborghini and made it look like I was probably involved in some kind of money laundering scheme." "There are articles, Dave," she continued, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd just discovered that their spouse had been leading a double life. Except instead of having a secret family or running drugs across state lines, I'd been secretly successful at business. Multiple articles. In magazines. With pictures. They called you an automotive restoration genius and a rising star in the classic car investment world. I could hear her breathing heavily, like she'd been hyperventilating while reading about my professional achievements. The articles she'd found were probably just the tip of the iceberg. Automotive magazines loved writing about success stories in the restoration business, especially when the subject was young enough to not look like he'd been working on cars since the Model T was considered cutting-edge technology. Well, I said, settling into my kitchen chair with my morning coffee. Genius might be a strong word. I prefer a moderately talented guy who got lucky and happened to have good timing in a market that rewards people who can make rusty metal look shiny again. Don't sound so surprised, I added, because the shock in her voice was starting to make me feel like some kind of criminal mastermind who'd been running an elaborate con instead of just a guy who'd kept his professional success separate from his family life for entirely reasonable reasons. The transformation that followed was like watching a nature documentary about adaptation, except instead of animals evolving to survive in new environments, it was my in-laws evolving to cope with the reality that they'd been completely wrong about their son-in-law's place in the socioeconomic food chain. Her father went from treating me like a well-meaning but financially incompetent relative to bragging about me around town like I was his own personal success story. Suddenly, everyone at his weekly poker game was hearing about his son-in-law, the automotive mogul, who had revolutionary restoration techniques and an eye for classic car investment opportunities that most people couldn't recognize if they were painted neon green and covered in flashing lights. The term automotive mogul was particularly amusing, considering that just a week earlier, this same man had been offering me advice about the importance of checking tire pressure to improve fuel efficiency, apparently under the assumption that I was carefully monitoring every penny spent on gasoline, like someone living on a fixed income made up of government assistance and loose change found in couch cushions. Her mother underwent an equally dramatic transformation, trading her role as the helpful mother-in-law who clipped coupons for me and offered gentle suggestions about store-brand alternatives for something approaching automotive royalty enthusiast. She started attending classic car shows like she was some kind of collector's queen, wearing outfits that suggested she'd always been part of this world instead of someone who'd learned the difference between a Mustang and a Camaro approximately 72 hours earlier. The car shows were particularly entertaining to watch because she'd appointed herself as my unofficial ambassador to the classic car community, introducing herself to strangers as the mother-in-law of that restoration expert everyone's been talking about, and nodding knowledgeably when people discussed engine specifications and paint restoration techniques that she'd probably Googled 5 minutes before arriving. My wife, meanwhile, had discovered the concept of respect like it was a foreign language she'd suddenly become fluent in overnight. Gone were the eye rolls when I spent time in the garage, replaced by something approaching reverence for my important business work. Gone were the comments about my expensive hobbies, replaced by questions about my investment strategies and market insights. The change was so dramatic it was almost comical. She started referring to my garage as my workshop and my restoration projects as my portfolio acquisitions. When people asked what her husband did for a living, instead of the vague mumbling about car stuff that had been her standard response for years, she now launched into detailed explanations about the classic car restoration market and my innovative approach to automotive preservation. Even my brother-in-law, Chad, yes, his name was still Chad, and no, that wasn't going to get any less ridiculous, called me asking for a job. The same Chad who'd spent the last 2 years explaining to anyone who'd listen how NFTs were going to revolutionize the art world and how his collection of digital cartoon animals wearing different hats was basically his retirement fund. "Hey Dave," he said when he called, his voice carrying the kind of forced casualness that people use when they're about to ask for something they're not entirely sure they deserve. "I've been thinking about maybe transitioning into a more traditional business model, you know? Something with, like, actual physical products that people can touch and stuff." The transition from revolutionary digital art investor to guy who wants to work with actual tangible objects had apparently happened sometime between discovering that his cartoon monkey NFTs had lost 90% of their value and learning that his sister's husband owned multiple businesses that dealt in items people actually wanted to buy. "Sure, Chad," I told him, enjoying this conversation more than I probably should have. "I'd be happy to find you a position. As long as you're comfortable starting at the bottom, learning the basics, and earning your way up like everyone else. Think you can handle polishing hubcaps for minimum wage while you learn the business?" The silence that followed suggested that Chad was discovering the difference between being a digital entrepreneur and being someone who actually worked for a living. A year later, I was sitting in the conference room of what used to be a nondescript office building, but had recently been transformed into the headquarters of the Bennett Foundation for Young Mechanics, a nonprofit organization that existed for one simple reason: to make sure that other people didn't have to spend their 20s pretending to be broke while secretly building business empires in their garages. The foundation had been funded partly by Elvis's Cadillac sale, which seemed fitting in a cosmic justice kind of way. My wife's spectacular mistake had inadvertently become the seed money for something that would help kids who actually were broke. Kids who had the talent and passion for automotive restoration, but couldn't afford the training, tools, or connections to turn that passion into a career. We gave scholarships to young people who wanted to learn auto restoration but couldn't afford the community college programs, the trade school certifications, or the apprenticeships that would get them started in the field. We provided tools, workspace, mentorship, and most importantly, we taught them that working with your hands didn't mean you had to be poor, that mechanical skills were actually incredibly valuable in a world where everyone else was staring at computer screens and forgetting how to fix anything that existed in the physical realm. The irony wasn't lost on me that my wife's attempt to solve our non-existent financial problems had created a foundation dedicated to solving other people's very real financial problems. It was like she'd accidentally performed some kind of economic alchemy, transforming her ignorance about classic cars into opportunities for kids who knew exactly what they were looking at, but lacked the resources to do anything about it. Charles Morrison had become something of a partner in this endeavor, though not in any way I could have predicted. When I'd explained what I wanted to do with the foundation, he'd made an offer that was either incredibly generous or incredibly smart, probably both. He would display Elvis's Cadillac in his showroom permanently, with all the proceeds from people paying to see it going directly to the foundation. It was a win-win situation. He got to showcase the most famous piece in his collection, and we got a steady stream of funding from people who wanted to see the King's Golden Chariot up close. The plaque he'd installed next to the car was a masterpiece of understated revenge, on permanent loan from the Bennett Foundation, proof that some people don't know what they've got until they sell it for $900. Every time someone read that plaque, they got the full story of how close this piece of automotive history had come to disappearing into some random person's driveway, sold by someone who thought it was just another old car taking up space. Every few months, I made a pilgrimage to Morrison's showroom, not because I missed the car, though I did, but because sitting in that golden beauty and looking at that plaque gave me a satisfaction that was worth more than the $2.8 million it represented. It was the satisfaction of knowing that I'd turned my wife's mistake into something positive, that I'd taken her spectacular misjudgment and transformed it into opportunities for people who deserved them. The car looked magnificent under Morrison's professional lighting, every gold-plated surface gleaming like it was auditioning for a music video. People came from all over the country to see it, to touch the steering wheel that Elvis had gripped, to sit in the seats where the King had probably hummed along to songs that would become classics. They paid $20 each for the privilege, and every $20 went to some kid in Ohio or Alabama or California who had dreams of restoring classic cars, but needed help making those dreams reality. My marriage had survived the Cadillac incident, though it had required some significant recalibration of expectations and assumptions. My wife had gone through what could charitably be called a learning experience, discovering that her husband wasn't the financially incompetent project she'd thought she'd married, but was actually someone who'd been quietly successful at business, while she'd been offering him advice about coupon strategies and the importance of generic brand products. The respect thing had taken some getting used to, honestly. After 5 years of being treated like someone who needed guidance on basic adult responsibilities, suddenly being viewed as the financial mastermind of the relationship was a dramatic shift. But it was better than the alternative, and my wife had proven surprisingly adaptable once she'd gotten over the initial shock of discovering that her supposedly broke husband owned more assets than most small corporations. Her family had also undergone their own transformation, trading their roles as the concerned relatives who worried about my financial stability for something approaching automotive groupies who name-dropped their connection to me at every opportunity. Her father had become the unofficial historian of my business success, regaling anyone who'd listen with stories about the early days when Dave was building his empire right under our noses. Her mother had appointed herself as my social media manager, posting pictures of classic cars on Facebook with captions like, "My son-in-law would know how to restore this beauty." Chad had actually taken the job polishing hubcaps, though his transformation from NFT entrepreneur to actual employee had been about as smooth as you'd expect. He'd lasted exactly 3 weeks before deciding that maybe digital art wasn't so bad after all. But those 3 weeks had taught him the valuable life lesson that real work was significantly more difficult than explaining cryptocurrency to strangers on the internet. But the real victory, the thing that made the whole experience worthwhile, was sitting in Elvis's Cadillac on a Tuesday afternoon, watching teenagers from the Foundation's program examine classic cars with the kind of reverence and knowledge that my wife had never shown for the treasure that had been parked in our driveway for 5 years. These kids knew what they were looking at. They could identify a genuine restoration from across a parking lot, could spot the difference between original parts and reproductions, could tell you the market value of a vehicle just by looking at its condition and documentation. They were everything I'd been pretending not to be: knowledgeable, passionate, and completely unashamed of their expertise. And let's be real, who wouldn't want to end their story by saying, "My wife sold Elvis's Cadillac for less than the price of a used Honda Civic, and I turned that disaster into a foundation that's changing lives." It wasn't the ending I'd planned, but it was definitely better than anything I could have written myself.